Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first Budget Subcommittee number 3 hearing of the year. Happy New Year to everyone. I think we've probably had a chance to say Happy New Year to just about everyone, and we've got a few more days before the end of the month. I think Happy New Year's are officially over. If not, then we need a bill on that. So our hearing today is oversight on the subject of high-speed rail. The high-speed rail project was authorized by the voters in November of 2008, and it's one of the largest and most complex public works projects, not just in California's history, but in the nation's history. Like any construction project, particularly one that stretches over 500 miles and will take more than 12 years to complete, there are going to be hurdles and changes along the way. It's impossible to predict with precise certainty all of the costs and the intermediate timelines. But what we can do is make sure that we get the best available numbers on an ongoing basis and make sure that that's best based upon the best available information. This morning's oversight seeks to do that, and today we will be examining the cost estimates, project milestones, and engineering acumen of the High-Speed Rail Authority. A recent newspaper article suggested that the data provided by the authority in the 2014 business plan was more optimistic about the overall project costs than the information that the authority actually had. And I think we'll be getting some information from the chair and the chair of the peer review group to talk about the chair of the authority, I should say, and of the peer review group to talk about the project costs and the construction milestones that have been published by the authority. Now, I want to remind everyone that we've had several oversight hearings on the high-speed rail project since I became chair of the committee 3 years ago, and we've actually touched on this and other issues that were considered to be putting the project at risk. In 2014, we examined the cost and engineering challenges in building the segment from Bakersfield to the LA Basin. Last year, we heard about the possibility of cost increases through contractor change orders, and that's one reason that we pushed for more direct state oversight on the construction site. And last year, we heard about various facets of project risk that were articulated in the 2015 project update report, and also heard about what the authority was doing to mitigate those risks. This year, we plan to have at least 2 hearings on high-speed rail in this committee. Today's hearing is going to focus on the quality of the authority's numbers and project milestone projections. And we'll also have a second hearing in April where we will discuss the 2016 draft business plan. We expect to get that document in March, which will give us time to see the authority's latest projections for the project. This project is ambitious, it's complex, it's difficult, and it's, as I said earlier, it's full of risk. The voters approved this project, followed by the legislature with our appropriation of bond funds and cap-and-trade revenues. So moving forward, it's our responsibility to ensure that the state is doing its best to get value for its investment, that the authority is focused on the big picture, and that we do our best to avoid problems and pitfalls that we've seen in other big projects like this one. Assemblymember Frazier is here this morning. I think you're out there. Chair Frazier? Right. Oh, he did leave. Okay. Well, if he comes back, we're going to invite him to the table. I understand he may have a couple of questions, and we welcome him to the proceeding. But in the meantime, we'll get started with our speakers today. We have Dan Richard, the chairman of the California High-Speed Rail Authority Board of Directors, Jeff Morales, the CEO of the California High-Speed Rail Authority, and Louis Thompson, the chair of the High-Speed Rail Peer Review Group. Before we do that, we're going to take roll, and I'm going to invite any of the other members of the committee to add remarks if they'd like.
Bloom?
Here.
Gordon?
Here.
Obernolte?
Here.
Patterson?
Here.
Williams?
Anyone? Mr. Patterson.
First of all, appreciate the opportunity to have an oversight hearing. I do want to register a little bit of concern with respect to the time. This is a very large project. I think that an oversight hearing of 90 minutes is insufficient to really dig into the the details of this, but I do appreciate the fact that we're having one. Would encourage us to continue with this and perhaps schedule a hearing in the future that has a little more time for us to delve into it. As a result, I've had a brief conversation with the chair. I have 3 questions and a comment at the end. I will keep it to that, although I have a lot of pages of notes here, but out of respect for the time and all of that. But would like to make sure that we get a real significant schedule of time. Lots of people have interest in this, and a lot of people, I think, would like to be a part of it. And I appreciate that.
Thank you. Let's begin with Mr. Richard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Dan Richard. I'm the chair of the California High-Speed Rail Authority Board. I apologize in advance for the quality of my voice this morning, getting over a cold. But I'm going to speak for just a few minutes on a couple of topics. With me this morning is the CEO of the authority, Mr. Jeff Morales. He heads our staff and manages the day-to-day operations of the authority. Mr. Chairman, first of all, I appreciate the comments that you made in opening this, and I'd like to assure you and your colleagues in the legislature and the public at large that we not only understand and respect the oversight role of this body, but we think it's essential to maintaining public confidence in what we do. And so we will be, as I think we have been, continue to be forthright with you. And we're always happy to meet with members individually or in any setting like this. And to the extent that you ever feel that we're less than responsive, this is something that would be of great concern to the board. Your committee consultant did an excellent job laying out in his report the function and role of the authority board. And so what I'd like to do is just very quickly touch on 3 topics. One, how we see the oversight of the organization at our level and what we do as a board to make sure that the project is being appropriately managed and that we are getting early warning of any problems. Second, I want to just touch briefly on the item that you mentioned, which has sparked a lot of interest about the report in the popular media that there were costs that both were in excess of what we were saying and that were somehow withheld, which is not correct. And then finally, just a general comment about our philosophy of how we approach this. So first of all, your oversight of this starts with the basic structure of the authority board. We are not like Caltrans or Department of Health Services or another executive agency, because the legislature, in establishing the High-Speed Rail Authority, provided that this body gets to contribute members to the authority board. So we have 9 members. The governor appoints 5, but the Speaker of the Assembly has 2 appointees, and the Pro Tem and the Rules Committee of the Senate have 2 appointees. So you already have on our board, among my colleagues, people who were appointed by the legislature and are there for the purpose of making sure that the policies of the legislature are carried out and that the program is proceeding as it's supposed to. Beyond that, I have to say, having served on a number of boards in public agencies and so forth, I think we have an excellent board because we are graced with the presence of people who have very specific subject matter expertise that's important. And one of the things that I'm proud of is that on the very first day that I assumed the gavel as chair of the board, the very first act after taking the gavel was to establish a finance and audit committee of the board. I have some experience in the private sector, 10 years as a corporate executive. One of my colleagues, Mike Rossi, was the vice chairman of Bank of America and the chief risk officer. He's currently the CEO of Shorenstein Companies. And we agreed that what we needed to bring to this enterprise, and it is an enterprise, it's not just building a project. The Bond Act says that we can only use the bonds to build a high-speed train that can operate without a subsidy. That makes this a business enterprise as much as a project delivery challenge. And so in order to make sure that we are treating this as a business would, we established a finance and audit committee. Mr. Rossi chairs it. Another gentleman, Tom Richards, name similar to mine but with an S, a very successful commercial real estate developer in Fresno, is the vice chair. And that committee meets every single month. prior to our board meetings. When I first established it, actually they would meet as they're permitted to under Bagley-Keene in closed session. But at the request of the legislature, coming out of Mr. Frazier's committee and others, we have opened those meetings. And in fact, members of the legislative staff attend our Finance and Audit Committee meetings. And if you come to the Finance and Audit Committee meetings, every month they go through a stack of reports from our staff that look at the ongoing expenditure of funds, but more than that, at risk factors. And the interesting thing about the way that they're approaching their job is to essentially manage the risk in terms of what is happening to the project contingency. Are we staying within our budget and contingency, or are things happening that could threaten that contingency? So month by month, we have people with deep financial and business background sitting on top of the staff looking at that. The other structural thing that's very important and should give the public confidence is that the person who's in charge of our risk management program, which I will tell you right now is probably the most sophisticated risk management program of any major infrastructure project anywhere, that person reports administratively to Mr. Morales, but reports to the board directly. And our chief auditor reports to the board directly. And so those are tripwires for us. I've said publicly, for example, that on the right-of-way acquisition, we were slow out of the blocks. I knew that because of audit functions coming to us and telling us where we were. And that gave us the opportunity to adjust, to put more resources on it, and to catch up, which we've done. So I'm trying to emphasize here that this is not a board that views its job as a sinecure. This is not a board that is uninvolved. I think Mr. Morales would testify to the fact that the board is not uninvolved. And because of that, at the board level, we are trying to stay on top of this because we understand the nature of these big projects. The second thing I want, and let me also say, in addition to that, the authorizing legislation that appropriated the bonds from this body, Senate Bill 1029 in the 2012 session, included a requirement that twice a year we submit detailed reports to the legislature. And we don't submit them directly. We submit them to the Secretary of Transportation, who also has to put his name on them to send them to this body. So we think that there are a number of tripwires and safety valves that should provide the legislature an overall sense of how this project's being managed, in addition to your role of direct inquiry. Second point I want to make, as the chair mentioned, part of the reason we're here today is because there was a report in a major newspaper, one of California's major newspapers, that the project had a confidential report, I think was the quote, that showed that there was a 31% increase in cost for major parts of the project. Let me just state now what we stated to the reporter then and to his newspaper. That is totally incorrect. Mr. Morales is going to go into this in more detail. There is no 31% increase in cost. There is no secret confidential report. It was a draft PowerPoint, which I have in my hand. It's been provided to the legislature because the Speaker of the Assembly asked for it, and we gave it to her, which she distributed to members of the legislature. It was a draft. It was part of many, many, many documents that went into the development of our 2014 business plan. And I'll be prepared to answer your questions as to why, at the board level, we made the decisions we made with our eyes open about how to assess the projected costs, which, if anything, have been coming down. And you'll see more about that as we come out with our new business plan. Finally, Mr. Chairman, you alluded to something that I wanted to touch on as my third point. This is the nation's largest infrastructure project. We're aware of that every single day. And frankly, for those of us who believe that America ought to be in the business of building high-speed trains, if we screw this up, we are going to set back the cause of high-speed surface rail transportation across the country. If we do it right, I believe that it's going to open up vistas across the United States. We feel a very heavy responsibility on our shoulders. And as you said, There are going to be problems. I'm not going to insult this committee or your colleagues or the public by saying there aren't going to be bumps in the road. There aren't going to be times when we wake up and say, oh my goodness, this cost looks like it's increasing over here. At those moments, we are not going to go off in a corner and curl up in a ball. Our job then is to roll up our sleeves and say, how do we drive offsetting cost reductions? How do we deal with the problems? And I believe that the public understands that projects like this will have challenges. What they look to for us and what we are accountable to them for and to you is how we deal with those challenges. And right now, I can tell you, sitting here today, that we feel that by and large, of the things that we control, we're on top of them. The costs are under control. There are some things outside of our control, like third-party utility relocation contracts. We're trying to develop strategies to deal with them. And we are actively managing this project to deliver it to the people of California. Thank you for the opportunity to appear here today, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Mr. Morales, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And let me echo Mr. Richards' comments in terms of our commitment to work with this committee, with the legislature as a whole, to ensure that as we move forward with the program, appropriate oversight is provided and that we're working in conjunction with you. I'll break my comments into two sections. First, I wanted to address the erroneous claims in the press report, as noted in the committee report, and then secondly, talk about the process that we use to develop our cost estimates and how we update those as we go forward. And then, of course, we'll be happy to respond to any questions that the committee will have. Let me just be very clear about the press report, as Mr. Richard was. There was no 31% increase in the cost of the program. We did not withhold information about a cost increase in the program because there was no such increase in the program. The confidential report, as it was called in the article, was in fact a draft PowerPoint presentation. It was marked draft, and it was presented early in the process of developing the 2014 business plan. It was marked draft because that's exactly what it was. It did not present any final conclusions, any determinations, and it was subject to review just like the literally hundreds of other inputs we get into the process as we go along. Nowhere in this PowerPoint was there a statement of a 31% increase in the program. That was a calculation made by the reporter based on either a lack of understanding or a misrepresentation of the information. Let me give a little bit of background and explain what this draft did say and do. As you know, Proposition 1A lays out the high-speed rail system in two phases. Phase 1 being San Francisco to Los Angeles, Phase 2 being the connections to San Diego and to Sacramento. In 2012 and in 2014, in the business plans, we laid out a plan for developing the Phase 1 system and broke it into pieces, identifying two separate initial operating segments, as well as an interim step along the way to developing the full Phase 1 system between San Francisco and Los Angeles. As part of that process, we estimated the cost of those individual segments and then the cost of the remaining pieces to get to Phase 1. One of those segments, identified by the board in 2011 and referenced in the 2012 and 2014 plan, was from Merced to the San Fernando Valley. The southern terminus of that segment in the San Fernando Valley was in the town of Sylmar. That segment, the cost of it was identified and described, and then the remaining cost south of Sylmar to Los Angeles and on to Anaheim was shown as part of Phase 1. In the course of developing the 2014 plan, we were looking at a potential extension of that system, the Phase 1 segment, or excuse me, the initial operating segment, from Sylmar down to Burbank, a 16-mile extension. That option was included in this draft PowerPoint presentation that was referred to as a confidential report. Now, the effect of shifting the terminus from Sylmar to Burbank resulted in an increase of 16 miles to the segment, a change in the scope of the segment, not growth in the cost of the previous segment. And as you know, that area is very highly urbanized. You're familiar with it, Mr. Chairman, certainly. And the cost of construction through that segment would be very high. Approximately $4 billion was the estimate at the time. We have a map which we can share which shows graphically what we're talking about, extending to a highly urbanized area. There's 16 miles of construction through there would be very costly, and that's what was identified in the PowerPoint. Now, increasing the length of that segment by 16 miles would mean showing the cost of that additional length, obviously in the first operating segment. At the same time, then we would remove that cost from the remaining Phase 1, because you don't pay for the same 16 miles twice in the program. So therefore, there would have been no change in the overall program cost, just a shift from one segment to the other. In the end, we decided against making that change from Sylmar to Burbank in the 2014 plan. And again, even if we had changed it, that would not have affected the overall cost of the program, contrary to the representation made in the article. The remaining cost differences that were included for discussion in this draft PowerPoint were based on a variety of potential changes that, in the end, were not adopted, either because there was sufficient information, there was not sufficient information to support those changes, or there was just no basis for changing the inputs into the estimates. I'll give you a specific example. In this draft, some of the technical staff had made an assumption of increasing the number of miles of the system between Bakersfield and Palmdale that would be built on viaduct as opposed to at grade or on embankment. Building on viaduct is much more expensive than building on embankment. That was an assumption made by some of the technical staff. The full team looked at it, decided there was no basis for that assumption, and so those numbers and the increase that would have been associated with that change was not included in the final numbers. It's worth noting that one of the biggest drivers in the reduced costs that we have seen in the Central Valley, the bids coming in below our estimates, has in fact been a shift from what we proposed and assumed would be viaduct structure to embankment or at-grade structures. So I think that decision of the technical team at the time in 2013 not to include those increased costs was certainly validated. Let me just say in closing on this, before then moving on to the broader discussion of cost estimating. Had the reporter made clear to us what he was looking at and how he was making his calculations and asked us to explain the costs, we certainly would have. Unfortunately, he chose not to. Now, speaking generally about the cost estimating process, as you can imagine, developing a cost estimate for a system 500 plus miles to be built over a decade or more, and for which most of the decisions have yet to be made is not a simple process. But the key is there is a process, and that's the real key. We use industry standard processes, which I'll describe. These processes have been thoroughly reviewed by independent experts and have been confirmed as appropriate and sound. For example, the Government Accountability Office of the federal government spent almost a year diving deeply into our processes. They evaluated our estimates against 4 key measures they have developed for evaluating cost estimates at other major programs. They looked at whether our estimates are comprehensive, well-documented, accurate, and credible. It's worth noting, and they issued a report to the Congress on this after a year of review. We came out ranking higher than all but 2 of the 16 programs they had looked at across the country, and they made no recommendations for changes to our processes. We also had experts from the International Union of Railways, the UIC, review our estimates and our methodologies. They compared us with an index of 12 systems from around the world and found the processes, methodologies, and estimates to be in line. As you'll hear from Lou Thompson shortly, the independent peer review group also evaluated our estimates and reported to the legislature that the estimating work is in accord with professional standards and that the estimates and contingencies are within expected limits. In terms of the process, believe it or not, there is actually a thing called the American Association of Cost Engineers, and they create the standards for how this sort of work is done. Our process is carried out under those standards and those guidelines. one thing we do, and we follow that, the one thing we do that actually is above and beyond those standards is subject all of our work to risk analysis that goes above and beyond what's normally required. Developing and updating an estimate includes multiple inputs which change over time. And arriving at the estimate requires taking all of those inputs into account and the variables associated with each input. In fact, there are some 200,000 line items that go into the Phase 1 estimate as we put this together. Some of these inputs are based on relatively black and white data. For example, how much a cubic yard of concrete costs. Others have much greater variability and require discussion, debate, and assumptions. And throughout the process, there will be dozens, if not hundreds, of options presented, meetings to discuss this, and all the evaluation of all these variables. Even seemingly simple items require discussion. Take, for instance, the cost of rail. Our team uses unit costs and quantities to determine the cost of rail. So we look at cost of rail on a linear basis, a yard, a mile of rail, multiply it by the length of the system. Those unit costs are pulled from industry databases. But even that has multiple variables. For example, we haven't established the full alignment for the system. So there's uncertainty about the exact length of the system and the amount of steel required. In addition, we have to anticipate when the rail will be purchased and project that price out in the future. The same process is used for all the materials, concrete, dirt, commodities, as well as electrical and communication systems, and even the trains. They're pulled together under standard cost estimates established by the Federal Railroad Administration, and those are the cost categories that you see presented in our business plan. We also publish with the business plan a technical memorandum that details the inputs and the methodologies into our capital and life cycle cost estimates. That's presented, made available to the public. It was some 61 pages, I believe, last time in 2014. Now, obviously, when making a projection about costs, especially out into the future, there are many uncertainties. And to address those, industry standards call for the application of contingencies. And we use two forms of that. Allocated contingency is applied to specific cost items addressing potential but not yet known changes. The level of contingency changes over time, factoring in the level of information and the stage of development of the program. Generally speaking, the more we know, the better defined the situation, the less contingency there is. Consistent with industry standards, we apply a contingency to each item, all of those 200,000 line items I talked about, in a range of 10 to 25%. And again, that's reflected in the numbers in the business plan. Separately, there is unallocated contingency, and that's applied across the entire program, not to specific line items, to cover unknown circumstances or factors that aren't tied to specific items. That would include, for instance, delays tied to litigation. And consistent with best practice, we have a 5% unallocated contingency on top of the 25%. Altogether, there's in the $68 billion estimate, there's $10.9 billion of contingency, combination of allocated and unallocated in that estimate. We also present our estimates in two ways. First, in current or constant year dollars, and then secondly, in inflated year of expenditure dollars. As I think Mr. Thompson would attest, that's not always done on programs. Very often what you see are just the current year cost, what it would cost to build something today. In our plan, we use the latest full-year cost estimates to develop the current year, the base cost. And so you see a cost of $54.9 billion in 2013 dollars. We then inflated that out through 2029, all the various elements as we projected based on the schedule, resulting in a year of expenditure cost of $67.6 billion. So what that means is that in the $67.6 billion, almost $13 billion of that is time. It's inflation. And so like with any big program, the faster we get this built, the less it will cost. The longer it takes, the more it will cost. Let me just quickly talk about the business plan and how we update the estimates. We use the 2012 estimate as our baseline and then update that with new information. including commodity costs, advances in information, advances in the design, environmental planning elements of the program. We don't lower an estimate without justification and backup, and we don't raise an estimate without justification and backup. We also apply lessons learned from actual costs as part of a broad value engineering effort we work on continuously. As you know, we're using a design-build process in our contracts in the Central Valley. A key element to that, which we're working hard to capture, is the opportunity for bidders to innovate and bring in the program more cost-effectively and faster. Through this process, hundreds of millions of dollars of efficiencies and cost reductions have been brought to the program. Not only are these innovations being put to use in the Central Valley, but because we own the rights to those ideas, we can use them elsewhere in the system, and we're doing that. As we move forward, we incorporate all of this into the updated estimates, both positive and negative issues as they come to bear. Obviously, there are factors that could affect the cost of the program that we can't control, things like inflation, sharp increases in the prices of materials, externally imposed delays, and funding availability. But we continuously look for ways to contain and even reduce the cost of things we can control through smarter design, more efficient processes, and other steps. We'll have a draft business plan out in the next month, and you'll see updated cost estimates developed through this process that I've described. So in closing, let me reiterate 3 key points. First, again, there was no and is no 31% cost increase as represented erroneously in the press report. And while I'll not suggest that the early results of the program will necessarily hold throughout the entire program, the fact is that the only actual data points that we have in terms of comparison of actual cost against estimates are the first 3 contracts that we've gone forward with in the Central Valley. Each of those has come in significantly below estimates. Secondly, our processes and our methodology for developing and updating cost estimates is industry standard, has been reviewed and confirmed by independent experts both within the U.S. and abroad. And then third, to reiterate Mr. Richards' point, we have been and we will continue to be transparent in providing the legislature and the public with information about how we develop these estimates and other figures. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I'm happy to answer questions at the appropriate time.